Yeah, as long as I don't screw up the name.
Yeah.
DIY recording guys.
Yep.
I don't know why I was screwing it up the other time. That even sounds better.
You're listening to the DIY Recording Guys podcast, your one-stop information source for DIY music production, with your hosts, Vadim and Benjamin Hall.
And welcome to another episode of the DIY Recording Guys podcast. As always, I'm your host, Benjamin Hall, here with my co-host, Vadim.
Hey, Ben. How's it going?
It's going good, man. I don't know if I've ever asked you how to pronounce your last name.
Ooh, good topic. It's just Karaz. The H is just, it's a red herring H.
Okay. That's what I would have guessed, but I was too nervous to say it out loud.
Yeah.
Very unique name, man. I like it. It's metal. It's very metal.
Yeah. For sure.
So I'm going to flip the script on you this week. Tell me one thing non-recording or music related that's been going on in your life.
Yeah, non-recording or music related. So yeah, my wife and I, we just recently got back from California. We were out there for a wedding. Yeah, and it was Southern California, kind of
beautiful.
Inland. It was the desert. It was really beautiful. But there was a couple of really weird things. If you're not familiar with the desert, which I'm not so familiar with it, it's like 95 degrees in the sun, but like 30 degrees in the shade. It's the weirdest thing.
That's so crazy.
It could be both freezing and hot within a span of 45 seconds. And then the second thing was the whole weekend we're out there for this wedding, everybody's just like lathering on the chapstick, and I'm like, "What? This chapstick is for kids. I'm not putting on chapstick." And my lips are just did that thing that snakes do when they like shed their old skin.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so I'm just now starting to become a human again.
Oh my gosh.
Is
that from dehydration or sunburn?
Yeah, I think it's just so dry. It's just so arid that it just like pulls all the moisture out of your body. It's that's not science. I just made that up, but that's what it felt like.
That's true,
and it was,
though.
Yeah. So that's what's been up with me.
I had that similar experience when I went out to Colorado for a week because it's really dry out there too. And you know, where I'm from here in Pittsburgh, I'm sure it's similar in Philadelphia, but in Pittsburgh, it's so humid all the time. My body's just used to that. And going to a dry environment, it's just like, ugh, can't deal.
Yeah,
well, cool,
you gotta
man.
drink a ton of water.
Yeah, a ton of water. But that's awesome, man. Weddings are great.
Yeah, for sure.
Sweet. So what are we talking about this week?
This week, we are talking about workflow. We're just talking about some basic studio best practices. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this because this is not something that we've talked about a lot offline. So we're kind of going into this cold. And we actually, we agree on a lot of things. Almost too much to be like, to be a viable podcast. I think we agree on is a very non-controversial things we say. So I'm curious if workflow is going to be similar for that. Yeah, I know. Well, even from a little bit of talking, I know that we'll have some things that are different or maybe some things that we focus on. Even if we have the overall same approach, I think our focuses are going to be slightly different. And that's going to be cool to... I'm excited just to learn some new stuff. So that'll be fun. That's definitely one of the fun things about doing this. Heck yeah. Absolutely. So how do you want to go about this? All right. Well, I'm going to ask you a question here. So I'm a musician, let's say, and I call you up and I want to come in for a session. So I have a trio. All right. I play guitar. I have a bass player and a drummer, and I want to come in and record a song. Are you also the vocalist? Yes. Okay. Okay, cool. Sure. I'm also the vocalist. So I call you up and I say, hey, look, we want to come in and do these songs. What's your thought process on how you prepare for the session and how you're going to approach this project? So the first thing that I do is I ask a lot of questions. Through asking questions, I like to prepare the band for
what they're getting into and start getting them to think along the same thought process that I'm thinking along. And some of those questions might be, do you want help with production for your songs? Do you need help writing them? Are they completely finished and they're exactly the way that you want to record them? Or are you open to input? Do you want essentially me to also take a producer role in that as well? And I think I normally find out a lot just from asking that question, because sometimes you'll find out that a band really is looking to go into the studio to make their songs better because they know that they're maybe not as good as they want them to be. And other times, sometimes a band has been playing a song or a group of songs so much live that it's almost hard for them to change, and they kind of have the structure down already. So in that scenario, I take more of just an engineer approach.
Okay.
Less creative and more engineer. So I'll ask that kind of a question. Then I like to get into as well, how comfortable are you guys playing to a click? Are you more of a live jam band, or it's so interesting nowadays, because I'm going to start showing my age a little bit, but whenever I was playing in bands and when I was growing up right around that age of like really getting into music, a lot of bands that I looked up to and a lot of bands that I played in, we were writing songs in the jam room together, almost kind of jamming them out. And even my workflow has changed a lot. But what I was going to say is I feel like the script has flipped a lot, where most bands nowadays are kind of, you have one main songwriter and he's kind of writing all the parts, and then everybody else is in the band is filling in as necessary. Or they're writing everything, like this new band that I've been playing with, Nafel. They sent me all the bass parts. The whole song was written out in Guitar Pro as tab and MIDI. And I think that the guitar player wrote all the parts on his guitar first and then tabbed it in. But I've heard of people writing stuff actually in Guitar Pro itself and then learning it on guitar. So you have two completely different approaches of, yeah, we're a jam band and we like to feel things out live, or we're a more mathematical band and everything has already been programmed and we just have to reproduce it now. So based on those two different scenarios, I would take a very different approach. So with the more live jam bandy type of band, and I actually did this with a project not too long ago, but they had never been in a studio before, so they weren't used to tracking or playing with a click. So what I did was, but they were a really good band playing together. So what I did was I set up my house so that they could all be playing at the same time and be monitoring and hearing each other. But I didn't have enough inputs to be able to track everything for the final takes. So my idea behind that was, I'm going to record them playing and get that live feel, and that's going to be the pre-production. And then I built the click track around what they played. So I had a organic click, I guess you could say. It wasn't a steady click. I mapped the click to the metronome to their performance.
Okay.
And then once I had the pre-production done, and now I did do a little bit of editing where maybe they sped up a little bit too much. I kind of spaced out those parts so that it didn't sound, it still sounded like a studio recording, but it sounded more like that organic live feel. So then after doing the pre-production, then I had everybody go back and do their final tracks solo by themselves, playing along to their pre-production.
Even the drummer, or did you keep the drum tracks from that original?
Even the drummer, because I don't have enough inputs that I wanted to use. So my goal was, I threw everybody in a room and I got it together really quick. I wasn't concerned about miking technique or anything. I just wanted to capture the performances.
Gotcha. You just wanted them to be, you just mic'd it so that they could hear each other and themselves.
Yes, because I wanted to capture and I wanted them to get comfortable. And also myself, I wanted to get the vibe of what the band felt like playing together. And
just to help you understand what they're going for.
Yeah. And then after we got that and kind of the feel was captured, then we could go back and take a more microscopic approach and record each instrument separately and really work on the tones that way. And it wound up working out really cool. And I like records like that because I used to always wonder, it doesn't sound like they played to a click. How did they all play together? And that's kind of one way of doing it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of doing it. And as you're talking, I think it's good for people to consider their own scenarios. Like even if you're recording yourself or you're going into a studio, these same questions that Ben is talking about, those are some of the things you want to ask yourself. It's like, what kind of a band are we? What's our tracking strategy going to be? Are these songs well fleshed out? Are we open to suggestions? Because a lot of, as producers and mix engineers, that's always a sensitive subject, right? And I also like to ask that question up front because sometimes people say, yeah, man, these are just, rough ideas. Give me what you got and I'll throw out something crazy, maybe like a flute solo, right?
It's always the flute solo with you, man.
yeah. I don't know what it is. I got flute on the mind. But in other cases, they may be like, listen, this is it, right? This is what we want to do. Or they might even have their own click track set up. And then it's like, cool, let's do that,
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea too, because sometimes you run into a scenario where maybe there's one member in the band that just can't like play to a click or play by himself. You know what I mean? He has to play with the group to kind of feel time out. And instead of beating your head against the wall and saying, no, this is the way you have to play it, a good way of getting around that is kind of what I did with this band, is saying, let's all play together and then we'll go back and track to that, because sometimes it's just hard to jump from solely, you're only playing in a band, you're only playing live and getting the sound of everything together, to just isolating and being a drummer just playing to a metronome. Like, that's so hard. That's
what I was going to ask you with that setup you did. I mean, that's got to be pretty tricky unless the drummer was pretty on the first time. I think it's tricky enough for drummers to play to a click. So he's playing to an off or an organic click, as you said. How did that go? Was he comfortable doing that?
That's a good point to bring up, because it was like a blues rock type of project. And the drummer had a pretty good sense of time, but they weren't playing anything too crazy that they were going to get off the click. Like, I wouldn't do that with metalcore or with, something that has to be, or gent, something that has to be so rhythmic and precise. Yeah. There was room in that style of music to have the ebb and flow, the back and forth.
Gotcha. That's a big consideration. Yep.
Yeah. And so I guess sometimes if you're playing in a more technical type of band, like, that's just not going to be an option for you. You just have to kind of play to a click, essentially.
Right.
And that's kind of basically, that's basically all there is to say about that. Just pre-production with the band together, and then hone in on each instrument individually. And
what about you? Like, what do you do for like a session setup? Like, do you prepare your session in advance? How do you kind of go about the the session in your DAW? I mean,
oh, that's a good question. I didn't even talk about that. A lot of times I have templates already set up as to, okay, this is a rock band coming in. I've got all these tracks. I even have some plugins already, maybe preset to the way I know that, like, because I have a drum set here at my studio that a lot of times we'll just use the drum set I have here, and then the drummers will just bring their cymbals and snare drum. But I know the way that kit sounds, so I might as well already have my presets on there already. If I know that I'm always going to EQ it this way, I might as well have that loaded on while I'm recording, because it's going to sound closer to the finished product. And
there's a big thing with that. I assume that you also have in your templates the like the channel, the input routing and the output routing, right?
Yeah. I pre-plan all that stuff.
Yeah. So this is something to consider. Like, if you have an interface if you're working with a lot of channels on something like a drum kit, you may want to be consistent and say, channel 1 on my preamp is always the kick drum or whatever. And by being consistent, you are less likely to screw something up, which, we've all had. We've all hit record on a track and then realized that the input was set wrong and then we missed the take, right? So to avoid one of the best ways to keep those things from happening is through being consistent. And one of the best ways of being consistent is through using templates.
Yeah, I agree. And I try to take the extra time to label everything really well. Because after
in your DAW.
Because after you get through so many tracks, and you never think you're going to have a problem with this whenever you first start recording. You're excited, you just start recording.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden you open up a session and there's 20 tracks that just say guitar. And you're like, what in the world? What in the world was this? What were all these parts? What are they supposed to be? But the more precise, even though it's a pain to take time to do that, the more precise you can be in labeling, the more it'll help you later, or help your engineer or your mixing engineer if you're using somebody else.
Oh my God, I couldn't agree with you more. And this is something I've made this mistake so many times. And in Pro Tools, which is the DAW that I use, when you hit record, it starts creating a file. The default name it gives to that file is whatever name the track was. So when I create a new track, it comes in as audio 1. If I hit record, then that clip is going to be called audio 1, 0.0 or whatever. And you can get in a big session, you get confused really quickly.
Yeah.
And then you have a bunch of clips and you don't know what they were, which takes were the good ones. So yeah, being diligent up front and taking the time to ensure your routing is correct. When we say routing, we mean inputs and outputs. And then also naming your channels is going to go a long way to, especially if you do a long session, like an 8-hour day or something like that, and then you're tired. You come back the next day, and like you said, I think was spot on, is you think you'll remember.
Yeah.
But you won't.
No.
You never will. So yeah, that's huge.
Another life hack that I have is I always label my tracks with a number first, 2-digit number, 01, 02, 03. I've gotten up to 97. I've never gone past 100. I don't ever want to do a project that has more than 100 tracks. But yeah, I've gotten up to 97.
97?
Yeah, 97. It was a big pop song, huge production. There's like 40 There's like 40 tracks of synths and 40 tracks of like I'm exaggerating a little bit of just FX, like different just cymbal swells and things like that.
Yeah. The pop sessions do tend to get a little bit bigger, but
Craziness.
Yeah, that stuff will drive you crazy if it's not labeled. So with your numbering scheme, are you consistent with number 3 is always bass guitar or whatever? Do you have some kind of conventions?
Not really. The two things that I'll do is, I number everything sequentially, and the way I just like to do it is drums are first, bass, guitars, synths, effects, everything else, and then vocals are at the bottom. But the other thing I'll do naming wise is I'll put 01, 02, and then right after the number I'll put what grouping I want them in, like DRM for drum, BASS for bass, GTR for guitar, VOX. And the reason I do that is because oftentimes I like to do all of my pre-production, recording, and editing in one session, and then I'll export all the files so that they're all the same length, and then open them up in a new session to do mixing.
Yeah.
And whenever you export them and then bring them back in, if they're all labeled that way, they'll line up perfectly. Otherwise, they'll line up in numerical and alphabetical order, and it'll take you like an hour just to figure out what order they should be in again. And why waste that time?
That's interesting. Yeah, I also have templates, and I do the same thing where I have separate mix templates because during tracking, I'm not really worried about bussing as much as I am when I'm mixing. But yeah, I end up I don't number things, but I am consistent with like my drum kit is always first, and I'm consistent with how I set that up. So at least it does take me a couple of minutes to drag in. I mean, the genres I'm working with are not anywhere near 97 tracks. I'm more on like the, 30 would be a lot. But yeah, so I do take the time to drag those things in manually and make sure everything kind of came in okay. But yeah, I like that idea that if you number it, it kind of takes some of the sorting guesswork out of it for you. I do like that.
And obviously you're going to be more apt to do this if you're recording and mixing your own project, but you could do a little bit of good in the world if you're outsourcing it for mixing. And if you number them like that and send them off to whoever's mixing them and he just opens his session and it's in perfect order, he will love you. He or she will love you so much.
Yeah, that's true.
A quality of life thing.
Although the numbering, numbering is kind of a unique thing. Like somebody else's numbering convention may not be the same as yours.
That's true. But I guess at least you could put it in order that makes sense to you. I still think that as long as it's in some kind of logical sense.
Yeah, that's true. And usually, I mean, people do think similarly on these things, but for my part, as long as it's labeled, at least I'll deal with it.
The worst thing you can do is just have like weird symbols or like an inside joke. And I guess that's fine to do sometimes. Like sometimes we'll open a session and it's just like sexy bits or something like that. You're like, what the heck is that? And it's just some like funny effects track. And that's fine, but like if every single track is labeled that, then it's just frustrating. You're like, what the heck is this session?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, what were we gonna say?
During the so now you're recording. I guess this is probably also very situation dependent, but what's your strategy for like punching in or doing, fixing issues? And does it vary by instrument, or are you kind of consistent? Does it depend on the artist?
Yeah, I'd say I've kind of settled on when and this is really good advice if you're tracking yourself or tracking your band member too. I think it's important if you're running the control board, and that could be your computer. You're recording, let's say you're recording your bass player that's in your band. I think it's really important when you're in that role to take a very critical listening approach where you're listening for how good the performance is and where there are any mess ups, if any. Because a lot of times what I wind up doing is I'll let the musician or vocalist play through. Now, granted, if this is their first time through the song, I might just let them go the whole way through the song just to get warmed up. But once we go back for a final track or final takes, we'll go until I hear a mess up, and then we'll just kind of piecemeal go, okay, there was a mess up there. Let's go back and hit this. If it's bad enough, I'll just stop the recording. But if it's just like a little hiccup there, here and there, I'll let them go as long as they're comfortable. And that might be the whole way through a song or just a full verse or a chorus. But I like to go through the whole song until we feel like we get a good take. And that opposed to maybe just arbitrarily saying, okay, and let's just do 3 or 4 full passes through a song and we'll pick the best takes. Because I tried doing that at first because I thought that would be efficient, but so many times what winds up happening is there's one part of a song that's really difficult and the musician or vocalist just continuously screws up on that one part because you're thinking, oh, well, they messed it this time, we'll get it the next time. And then you listen to all 3 or 4 takes and it's messed up in the same spot every single time, so you have to wind up going back and punching in anyways. So the way I tend to go is I'll just go part by part until we get the whole way through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting strategy. I think it depends in part on the artist and in part on the genre as well. I do like to, I guess my workflow is a little bit different maybe in general because a lot of artists I work with, I'm doing the drum programming for their projects. So they're coming with, guitar riffs or bass riffs or just song ideas, and I'm doing the drums. So inevitably, if I'm doing the drums, they're going to be recording it to a click. But that also helps with, I think, doing drum programming is a great way to flesh out arrangements.
Yeah.
If you can kind of get your drum track straight, playing along with a drum track a lot of times helps artists kind of clarify what feels right to come next. You know, should this verse be 8 bars or 4 bars? Like that type of stuff is helped by drums. So I like to get the drums right first, and then let the musician practice to those drum tracks on their own before they actually come in for the tracking session. But then, yeah, I do like the idea for actually tracking, of playing all the way through and just, seeing how it goes. You kind of get a feel pretty quick. There's definitely some people who come in and like they play it through and you're like, that was kind of perfect. Let's just do it again for 2 or 3 more for posterity, right? So that's great if that happens, and then you can listen through and just kind of punch in the parts that maybe aren't quite perfect.
Yeah.
With vocals, it's a bit of we're going to do a whole episode on tracking vocals. But vocals can be a little trickier because vocalists, more so than other musicians, I think, need that time to warm up. I've done some vocal sessions with people, like for pop songs, where it's amazing going back and like comping the different takes. So when we say comping, we mean listening through and picking the best bits of each take and kind of stitching, the perfect take together, which again might sound like cheating, but for the pop genre, people get crazy with it. They'll comp on like the syllable by syllable level just to get that perfect vocal take. And it's amazing. I've had like, there's 10 takes of a verse and each one is better than the one before it because the singer is just getting more and more comfortable. So I like to usually push people in that scenario where I'll keep making them do it until kind of you reach that peak and it's not getting better anymore. But you have to worry a little bit with burning yourself out or burning the musician out, right? Yourself if you're recording yourself. So there is a bit of a strategy there, I think, with definitely play it through, see which parts are tricky, and then you wanna get those strong choruses, for example, out of the way and knocked out of the ballpark before you start worrying about backing vocals or something like that.
No, that's a really good point. And I think when you're doing a multiple song project, it's important to keep those strategies in mind. I think most important is the vocalist, because if a vocalist burns their voice out, then they're just shot. Then there's nothing you can do at that point but rest. And that might mean a week off from singing at the worst. And so at the very most, I think it's okay to make some concessions for the other instruments to keep the vocalist in like tip-top shape. And what I mean by that is if you want to record a full album and you do all the other parts and then all that's left is the vocals and you only gave like a day to finish it, that's like the worst case scenario.
That's a worst case scenario. You're absolutely right. There's a lot to be said for, don't track everything and then make the vocalist shout your choruses for 10 songs straight. That's not a good idea.
And depending on the physiology and the talent of the vocalist, like I've never recorded somebody like this, but I've heard of some vocalists being able to go for like 8 hours and they just can do it. But if you're recording somebody like me, I've got like maybe an hour max of good vocals, and then it's all downhill after that. It doesn't matter, what the part is. My voice is just shot because it's weak. And you're going to find vocalists depending on, your music or how much you've practiced, your ability is going to be somewhere in between there, probably.
Yeah.
You're going to be a marathon runner or a sprinter. And it's important to keep in mind too with vocals when you're tracking them that once it starts getting difficult, that's a good place to like cap it for a day or just to walk away because you're only doing damage at that point. I think with some other instruments, you can kind of push through it a little bit more. So maybe that's a good thing to talk about because you said you like to push vocalists in that way, but let's be specific about what we mean by pushing a vocalist.
Yeah. So what I mean is I'm trying to, this is a bit of a tricky act because it depends on kind of the rapport you have with the vocalist. But in general, I'm listening for, are they getting more comfortable and more confident? Because like recording is a little nerve-wracking, especially if you're not used to doing it. You're kind of, you got somebody sitting there listening to your every breath and got this microphone looking at you, and there's a bunch of, it's a studio, it's a little weird. So I'm trying to just gauge if they're getting more comfortable. And if they are, a lot of times when a take is done, it's kind of like, let's do it. Like, that one was good, we'll talk about it. And it's like, let's try one more, let's do it. Let's do it again and see what we got. And then, or sometimes I'll even say like, you know what, I think that one works. Let's just try one more and see what happens. And that kind of instills a little bit of comfort level in them too, where they're like, okay, well, we have a good one, so I'm going to let loose a little bit on this one. And that lets you capture some of those little maybe nuanced moments that you may not have gotten otherwise.
No, that's a good point. I feel the exact same way about it, where you're trying to push them to be at their absolute best, but you're not pushing them beyond their ability.
No, It's not like, again.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can do that a little bit more with instrumentalists because it's not gonna seriously hurt them as much as it could hurt a vocalist and their voice.
Yeah, vocals are definitely tricky. So back to workflow. So drums are, for me, a lot of times they're a given because I've done them in advance and I have the session set up in advance. And for really rhythmically tight things, what I like to do is track the instruments to the drums. Like if it's a really intricate part where tight rhythm is really important, I'll have the guitars track just to the drums, and then I'll have a double track again just to the drums, so without the first guitar part playing. And I find that doing that, tracking just to the drums, kind of gives you the tightest performance because you kind of can't hide sloppy rhythm behind other instrument parts that are already recorded. So then, like recording bass, again, a lot of time, the bass is a little bit different, but if the bass part is really well defined, if the bass player knows exactly what they're playing, I might have them recorded just to the drums also, again, just to keep that rhythmic consistency, which for some genres, like, some math rock and prog stuff and gent stuff is really important. There is a trade-off there, and that you maybe lose something where if you're listening to the whole band playing and you're recording your guitar part, you might come up with some little flares or little nuances which are actually really cool and really creative. So it kind of depends on how rigid the arrangement already is. You got any thoughts on that?
I feel like I have so many thoughts on this, but it's
I could see the gears in your head.
Yeah, but it's so good. So you bring up a lot of really good points, and being that I record a lot of live drummers, I think the caveat needs said that a lot of times I won't move on in a project to the next instrument until I edit the previous instrument that I've tracked. So if I'm tracking drums, after we're done tracking, whether that's an hour or 2 hours on a song, I'll have the band like just take a break, and then I spend the next hour editing the drums. And they might not even be the final edits, but it's closer to a grid because then that way, if the bass or the guitar have to track along with the drums, it's going to be a tighter performance. Because if you have a drummer that's maybe pushing and pulling on the beat a little bit, and then you have a bass player or a guitar player track to that, they're going to be following the drums more than the click. And if you have to go back after all the tracking is done, and then you say, oh, now I want to edit it, you can get into some really weird, funky pushing and pulling.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, and it depends on how much time I'll take to do that, depending on how tight each band member is in the genre. One interesting thing I wanted to say, though, is from a musician standpoint myself, if I'm tracking stuff, my favorite thing to do, and I encourage musicians to do this in my studio if they're up for it, but sometimes I'll suggest just track to the click. Don't even track to the drums, because it's actually tighter if you can track to just the metronome.
Interesting.
Because sometimes you can get distracted by the drum beat and you won't even realize it. And I'm susceptible to this too, as long as I've been doing this, where if I'm playing bass and I'm doing a funky groove along with a drum beat, sometimes I'll anticipate certain notes because of the natural feel I put into it, but it's not actually correct. And if I just listen to the metronome and still try to play that same groove, it'll actually be more accurate and more tight. And so then when I'm listening back, it sounds so much punchier and more defined. And I just save myself all that editing time that I would have had to do.
What's the reason in that case? Like, let's say you had a drummer that was, why wouldn't you just have the other instrumentalist record just to the drum kit? Is it for that same reason, just because you think you'd get it tighter with the click or playing to the click?
I think it's tighter. I think it is genre specific though, because anything with a swing feel, whether that's blues or funk, or even I guess some pop songs are like that too. I think you kind of need some of the drum groove to get everybody like in that same feel.
Yep.
But if it's very math, if we're talking like math rock or some genres of metal where it's very precise, I think it's absolutely always going to be tighter if you can track to a click, if possible. And
Yeah.
a lot of, and it's okay if you can't do that, because a lot of musicians can't. They're so used to hearing the music, they need the context to like figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I was actually going to say along those lines, a lot of times I find it can be really hard to play to a click, and I'm talking about like maybe for a singer-songwriter now, even if that song isn't going to have drums, sometimes it's easier to just put just program a quick MIDI drum beat to it. For some reason, it's psychologically easier to play to a drum beat than just to like a sterile click for some people. I find that's true for me in some cases.
I agree with that.
Yeah, another strategy I was thinking of when you were talking about recording that blues rock band, I think this is something that's commonly done, is you can have the band play together. If you have enough inputs, you can actually record the drums in those takes. You kind of have to have two separate rooms for this to work, right? So the amps don't bleed into the drum mics. But you can use kind of the band playing together to capture that drum performance, and then just have the other instruments record over that drum performance. That's another thing that works if you have the luxury of two rooms, and you can set your monitoring up so that the drummer can hear the other instruments without those other instrument amps bleeding into the drum mics.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, if anything, you can get away with bass amp bleed into like a drum set because it's a little bit more subby. I've heard that on a few records and it's cool, but then you run into the problem of if you track it separately, that bass player has to play the exact same thing, or
Right.
you've got issues there.
Yeah.
So-
So again, maybe that depends on how tight, how rigid the arrangement actually is.
That could be a cool idea though for some bands. Let's say you have a really tight rhythm section, record the final tracks of the drums and the bass together. So you're going to treat the bass guitar like it's another drum mic in essence. You edit everything together. You could absolutely
That's a really
do that.
interesting idea. I like that. Get that rhythm section real solid. And the other thing, I mean, I always do this with bass and guitar actually, but especially with bass, is I always like to take a DI, right? So I'll split the signal and record a DI signal that I can play with later. And actually, yeah, I know you have some thoughts on this, so I'm curious to know what they are. A lot of times, I'll only take a bass DI, right? The only time I'll really, because for some reason I just like to, again, depending on how important the bass is in the song, but a lot of times I'll like to select my amp tones after the fact. The only time I really don't do that is if the bass player is like, no, look, they have a signal chain, they really like the tone they're getting out of their amp. Then I'll do both. I'll record the amp tone and the DI tone. And so that's another option too. If you're playing with a drummer, is basically you can split the signals from the guitars or from the bass, record the DI tracks, and then reamp them later, whether through those same amps or through some kind of digital voodoo that we'll talk about on a later episode. What are your thoughts on that? I know you said, do you record a bass DI when you track bass?
Always.
Okay.
And I guess hilariously enough, like I am a bass player. I have a pretty sweet bass rig, and a lot of times I just plug straight into my interface.
Really?
Yep.
And then what? Like, what do you, when you reamp those tones, do you reamp them through your rig, or you do it in the box?
I do a couple different things. I have this dark glass pedal that it has two different outputs on it, and one is an XLR that has a cab sim on it. So it has a really nice recorded impulse response of an SVT, like a 8x10 rig. And it sounds awesome. And just for the cab sound, sometimes I'll take that as an emulated line out. It is kind of like a DI, but it's an emulated line out. But I'll also take the raw DI. And then whenever when I reamp, I do everything digitally in the box.
So that pedal, that dark glass will actually split the signal. So you could take the cab sim and the DI simultaneously through it.
I don't remember off the top of my head. I might actually plug in a DI box before that, so that I can take the signal separately. I like to have that raw DI so I have ultimate freedom at the end.
I agree with you. So we may not have explained this. DI stands for direct inject, and what it is basically the raw signal coming off of the instrument. So if you have something like a bass, you could plug your bass into a signal splitter or a DI box that sometimes will have two different outputs. You could take one of those outputs and plug it directly into your interface, and that's kind of the raw signal coming right off of the instrument. You could take then the other signal path and route that either to an amp or, like Ben said, to a pedal or whatever you want to do there, and you could record those two signals simultaneously. Which then gives you or whoever's mixing the album maximum flexibility. So like a lot of times I have some amps in the studio and I have some amp simulators that I like a lot. I like getting the DI guitar tones because I can reamp through my own rig, and it's as if the guitarist was here playing through my rig. It's a really cool concept. It really gives you kind of maximum flexibility in the mixing phase and post-production phase.
Yeah, I think you should always grab a DI, regardless if you wind up using it or not, just to have those options. Because sometimes, if for no other reason than when you're physically miking up an amp, sometimes, and I've had this happen where I look back at a recording session and I'm like, oh my God, why do the waveforms look different in the second half of the song than in the first half? And I find out that like I didn't tighten down.
Somebody moved a mic.
A mic got moved, it got kicked, or maybe it wasn't tightened down and it like slowly fell out of position. And it's impossible to get that tone back because every millimeter you move that mic, it gives a completely different sound. So
that's a great point, especially if you have multiple people in the studio and everybody's moving around. The risk of something getting jostled increases. So yeah, I didn't even think about that, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, and it's also reminding me of some of the errors I made whenever I first started working in the studio. I remember one of the first projects I did, we recorded guitar tracks to this song, and it was taking so much longer than I thought it was going to take, and it was late at night. So I said, why don't we call it a night? We'll come back to it. And for some weird voodoo reason, even though we didn't move if the guitar just sounded different. The guitar coming through the amp just sounded different the next day. And so ever since then, like if I'm doing especially guitar that's mic'd up, I will get all the tracks done in the same session. I won't do overdubs the next day or finish a song the next day because I swear that even the humidity or the temperature change in the room changes how the guitar sounds. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And there's even like a trick that is helpful when you hit record, either before or after the take, is just record 45 seconds of silence. Because if you do need to do any punch-ins later, it's silence in quotes, right? Because you can actually capture like the weird room ambient sound of the day, and putting that in behind, like if you have to put in like a drum sample or something, putting in just the sound of the quote-unquote room silence will help it blend in. So I know people do that a lot, and I totally agree with you. Like things will just never sound the same. Once you hit off buttons and then come back the next day, it'll never sound quite the same. which is, having the DI is helpful for that because you can reamp everything in one shot. The other reason it's helpful is that I actually reamp through real amps a lot. If I'm recording myself, it's hard to be fiddling with an amp while holding a guitar while pressing record. So recording the guitar DI and then having it just play through the amp, I can walk over to the amp and start twiddling the knobs and kind of playing around with tones and see what works best. So it is a very, very powerful technique. And like Ben said, it's highly recommended to always take those DIs.
Yeah. I want to jump back a little bit because I don't think you said too much about pre-production, but how much of a role does pre-production play in your workflow when you're working with a group? And what does pre-production look like for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So pre-production in my mind is like all of the, the songwriting bits, the arranging. It's is the song too long? Is it too short? Does it feel right? And like you, I'll ask questions, and sometimes I'll get a song and I'll think, this is too many verses, right? So, but the first thing I'll ask the artist is like, are you open to suggestions here, or is this how it's going to be? And if that's how it's going to be, then so be it. But if they're open to suggestions, then usually, because again, a lot of times, most of the projects I'm working on, that's not true, but probably a little more than half of the projects I work on, I'm doing the drums for. I will use that as an opportunity to flesh out some pre-production. So usually what I do is I'll ask the artist to send me like a cell phone recording of themselves playing it. If they can do it to a click, that's perfect. Then I'll load that up and start putting drums to it. And it kind of lets me cut and paste parts and move things around if they're open to that kind of feedback. And then we could just go back and forth. Basically, it's like an iterative process. So I say, oh yeah, no, I like that, but we should, put verse 6 back in. It's like, okay, cool. We'll put verse 6 back in. So that's kind of the pre-production usually I handle before the session, right? Coming into the session, I usually feel more comfortable if the arrangement is fleshed out. I think it makes for a more efficient session. I think it makes for better rehearsed musicians as well.
Yeah, I agree with this so much. Like I'll try to get a hold of any kind of pre-production possible as early as possible so I can start getting some headway done. And the main reason for doing that, aside from solidifying the arrangement, is I'm curious to hear your answer to this as well, but how many times have you finished a production on a song? And well, I had this specifically happen for one project I was doing, which was only a mixing project. I wasn't recording it, so it was a little bit different. And the person who tracked all the parts, they did everything. They wrote the MIDI drums. I changed a little bit of the programming, but he programmed all the MIDI drums, played the bass, played the guitar, played the leads, played the keys, did the vocals. One-man band.
Okay.
So he sent it to me along with his rough mix. I got done mixing it, and then all of a sudden the vocals weren't good enough anymore. And not because the performances were necessarily bad, but everything was so much clearer and brighter and even more aggressive when I was done mixing it that his vocal emotion that he put into it didn't match the song anymore. Like, how many times has that happened to you? And maybe not just with vocals, but with... I'm thinking, what made me think of that was you're putting your drum parts into the song. I'm sure that inspires the guitar and bass players.
Yeah, so usually the drums come first, so it's more rare that I get like an already recorded guitar part. If at all possible, I like to have the arrangement worked out and have kind of the artist be satisfied with it. Yeah, sometimes things need to change. Sure, that happens.
Yeah, that's true. But it's interesting how things can change in that pre-production phase. And that's why I like to, the longer you can work in pre-production, the better the final takes will be. Like, I've had my least favorite thing to do, I think, is pre-production like the day that we're recording. Mostly because...
That's stressful.
Yeah, it's stressful just because, I guess in a good way, like a lot of times especially if I have a production role or a producer type role, I'll add some ideas and stuff, and then all of a sudden it's just kind of like the band, even if they've been playing this song for years, it just has new life all of a sudden. And then everything's different. They're like, well, what if we change this part and this part and this part? Like you said, I wish that if all times you could do the pre-production and then have the band practice with it, that's always better. But sometimes you can have magic whenever you're just kind of winging it, and you're going with your inspiration of, wow, this is happening right here, right now. Let's go and capture this.
Yeah, those are always awesome. Yeah, that does happen. Sometimes the session itself inspires things. That's another good workflow topic, actually, is at the end. I mean, you kind of were mentioning this in the last episode on adding in bits. I think it's always fun towards the end of a session to just listen through and be like, just with your instinct, like, I think a group of people shouting right before this next chorus would be like, just perfect. And then you can record those little, the sexy bits, like you call them.
Yeah.
That's the track that's referenced sexy bits. That stuff is really fun. That's some of the fun of being in a studio.
It is.
And with people that you may not have worked with before, is you get to have these really fun experiences.
And I think those parts too are, now you have to have a good song that's recorded well as the foundation, but those little extra parts are, it's so funny to me how often that's what takes a song from being good to great. And that's all the sparkle and the sheen. And I don't think before I got into production and started working in a studio, my ears were not as aware of that stuff as they are now.
You mean in listening to
songs that
other
I like.
People's music? Yeah, songs
exactly.
You like. Yeah.
Because even songs that I really like, or you intuitively have a sense of, wow, I love how this chorus sounds, and it just kind of opens up and makes me feel this way. But then if you really hone in and train your ears and listen, well, why do I feel this way? What's happening in the song? And you hear, oh my gosh, there's actually 8 different vocal harmonies happening that are all kind of buried in the mix, but they make it just sound so huge when that vocal comes in. And I never noticed that before. I just heard the vocal singing, but there's a whole choir behind them that's kind of buried. Or you'll hear, there's hand claps there. Oh, there's an egg shaker. There's a tambourine that comes in. All these little things that just add so much.
They really do. Yeah. It's, that stuff is really interesting. And that a lot of that stuff is, I think, that's where I think the gray area is between production and post-production, right? How much of that is pre-planned? How much of that happened during the recording session versus how much of that is, the mix engineer sitting there going, I think an egg shaker here would just really seal the deal.
One thing I'll add in there too, because I've had pushback from bands on this kind of a thing, and I always like to explain that those extra elements, and this is especially relevant to jam band type of bands. This is the kind of band that is, these are the parts, these are what I want to be on the record. So that blues band I was talking about, their name is The Unexpected, really great band. And it's a drummer, a bass player, 2 guitars, and one of the guitarists is the vocalist also. And that's all that they have whenever they play live. It's very raw. It's awesome. So, and they were great to work with, but they would give me a little bit of pushback whenever I'd want to add some of these extra parts or I want to layer some guitars, because in their argument, and it's a valid argument, is, well, we can't reproduce that live.
Yep.
And so what I like to tell bands is, listen, I know that you can't reproduce this live, but you need to make up for the lack of energy when you have somebody just listening to your record sitting calmly in their house. Because it's funny how having that visual aid of watching a band perform, it kind of fills in all of those gaps. But whenever you're not watching a live performance, you need something extra to keep the listener engaged. And
that's a great point.
And that's a lot of times why I like to add those. And in fact, in one of their songs, I still don't think they know this, and if they listen to this, they're going to find out. But in their first single that they released, I put a ballpark organ underneath the bridge where there's a guitar solo. And I hid it because I was afraid if they heard it, they would make me take it out. But but it's in there ever so slightly, and to the point where if I told you it was in there and you listened, you could hear it, but you might not notice it otherwise. But if you removed it, you could definitely feel that something has changed.
Just a gap, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there is a bit of weight to both arguments, and I think going in, if you're recording your band, you need to decide how authentic to your live sound you want to be. I think what you brought up an excellent point is that, that just listening, just having the audio, there is something, a bit of energy that you need to make up for. I also consider that, a recording is art in and of itself.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be necessarily reproduced live. That's how I've always kind of thought about it is, you're capturing something. It speaks for itself. It doesn't have to be necessarily reflective of your live show. But that's a decision that you and your band make, basically.
Yeah. Good stuff, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about some good recording workflows. So, you know what? I'll throw this out too. We forgot last episode, but, we want to hear your workflows as well. Have you guys thought of anything, or do you have any questions? Please reach out to us, whether that's in our Facebook group or personally on our Instagrams or whatever.
Yeah, we got to get better about
doing
about
that kind of thing. Yeah.
The bumper type stuff. But yeah, absolutely. So we have a Facebook group, so definitely join the community there. And yeah, we hope to have some discussions and take some of your questions and some of your thoughts. Ben, we'll talk again soon. Until next time, this is the DIY Recording Guys reminding you to check yourself
before you wreck yourself. Have a good one.
If you're enjoying the podcast, take a minute to leave a rating wherever you like to listen to it, or share it with your friends on social media. Also, Benjamin and I are working engineers, and we love helping people turn ideas into finished productions. So if you're interested in working with one of us, or just want to discuss a project you're working on, reach out. You can find my work at calmfrogrecording.com, get me on Instagram at calmfrogrecording, or shoot me an email, vk@calmfrogrecording.com. And you can check Benjamin's work out at dreamloudstudio.com. Hit him up on Instagram at dreamloudstudio, or by email, ben@dreamloudstudio.com. And finally, join our Facebook group to engage with a whole group of friendly, like-minded people who are interested in DIY recording. Just search for DIY Recording Guys on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening and for your continued support. We'll see you next week.